Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, as you can see, is the Atlantic world. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key words at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other, and as well as their larger historical significance. It'll prove very useful for you in any future assessment and essay you have to do in this class. Now with that, let's begin. Now, when we left off last time, we had finally kind of completed the settlement of the rest of the colonies, including those lower colonies, and we noted this evolution of labor, this transition, if you will, to the use of enslaved African labor. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up today a little bit. Because there's another side of that story. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about the horrific atrocities of enslaving individuals. This is a horrible crime in our history, and we will talk about that. But there's another side to what we want to focus on first before we get there. And that is what the Atlantic world really was. So we're going to start there first. And the reality is, despite the fact that we talked about how a lot of those were lower sort people that maybe didn't feel a part of English society, the reality was the colonists up and down the seaboard, the 13 original colonies, they were very proud to be British. They loved being British. They loved their king. King George was the greatest. They, again, had extreme nationalism. They believed that they were an extension of the British Empire as citizens, as Brits. And to maintain those ties, they were constantly looking back over the Atlantic to the motherland for news, for political stability, for connection and community. Again, you might think it would have made more sense for them to strike up relationships and culture with the Native American tribes. I mean, they live here now. This is who they live next to. Why not create a new culture? That would make sense. But this was not what the British wanted to do. They wanted to maintain that British unique culture. And so the reality is, most colonists in the American colonies view the Atlantic Ocean not as a wide chasm or a gulf, but rather a bridge. It is a bridge of information, it is a bridge of culture. Again, lots of colonists are involved in shipping, and especially wealthy colonists want to act like wealthy Europeans. They want to, again, pretend they are every bit a part of Europe as if they lived in London itself. And so they wanted to dress how Londoners did. They wanted to, say the same language and lingo. They wanted to, have the same material items, smoke the same type of cigarettes, drink the same kind of alcohol. Again, these are all things that show greater ties to the motherland. But, and this is the kind of topic for today's lecture, as the 1700s progress, as we move further, deeper into the 18th century here, we start seeing some changes. We start seeing a kind of a growing divide. Now, it's not all of a sudden. It's very, very slow. We start seeing changes in the colonies that begin to make them distinct from the mother country. And we can look at a couple things here. The first one we're going to talk about is newspapers. Because the reality is, again, this is what the Atlantic connection looks like, right? It's very connected. And one of the things that helped maintain this connection was the shipping industry and local colonial newspapers. And so what would happen is every time a new ship arrives in port, yes, they're bringing material goods. They might be bringing enslaved individuals. They may be bringing, manufactured goods, weapons, etc. But they're also bringing news of the motherland. And as such, many colonial cities, especially port cities, begin starting newspapers. And This served two functions. One is it did serve as a function of, hey, this is the economic outlook, blah, blah, blah. But more importantly, it told of information of the motherland. It told information that was going on in London, what Parliament was debating. It talked about, hey, this ship's arriving next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. Come on down to the docks and hear the latest gossip. And all this helped function to maintain these close, cohesive ties that they were British. And by 1740, every major colonial city, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, Charleston, they all had their colonial newspapers that, for the most part, helped maintain those connections. But as we're going to see as we go forward, these newspapers begin to change. They begin publishing less and less of what is being done in England and more of what's being done in the colonies. In other words, there is growing diversity from the motherland, growing distinction. The colonists themselves, the colonies, are becoming distinct. They are essentially burning that bridge and starting to separate from England. Now, one we already talked about, obviously, was we'll see how newspapers evolved in this time frame. But also there were a few other things that signified this and showed this during the 18th century. For example, one of the biggest ones was the use of slave labor. Using enslaved individuals to harvest crops, to take care of crops. This was actually diversity. Even though they maintained a strict racial superiority, a strict hierarchy, the reality is there was no enslaved labor in Europe, in England. Therefore, they're using a different form, not only are they using a different form of economic system, but you actually have physical diversity of different racial groups. In addition to Africans as a distinct, unique racial group, there are other diversities of ethnicities. We're going to start seeing a number of Scots and Scots-Irish, a number of Germans coming over. There's French here. And again, this is growing diversity, something you don't have in London. And so these kind of three major things. One is a different economic system based on enslaved labor. Number two, growing diversity of racial diversity, including Africans. And then number three, growing number of non-English immigrants. All these things begin, again, these are not major things at once. Again, in 1730, 1740, no one thought twice about these things. In fact, people back in England didn't think twice about these things. They were very happy because they're profiting mightily off the colonies. But all these things are just starting that wedge. It's going to start widening and widening and widening. But in either case, in the early 1700s, the reality was there was this Atlantic world, this Atlantic connection, this global exchange of trade. And of course, England and the colonies, therefore, were competing. Again, one of the things that kept them together was this competition. We talked about that last time with the Navigation Acts. This competition against the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. And each region of the colonies we've already discussed, we have the New England area, the middle colonies, the Chesapeake, the lower colonies. Each one has a different economic system, has a different diverse group of people who inhabit that region, and each one is making different amounts of money. Now, I've kind of made some jokes all along, if I were to ask you the question, where would you want to live? And almost everyone, when I ask this question, says, well, New England. I mean, yeah, Puritans, kind of is a weird little thing, but you live 70 years old there, and it's pretty stable, it's good climate, you make some money, see the world in shipping. I have a few more students always also will talk about the middle colonies. They love the idea of being Quaker, live around William Penn. It's fantastic. But then we get to the idea of, well, how much money would you actually make living there? And so I put together this very scientific, very academic graph to show you and demonstrate just how much money you will make if you chose to live in a given area. So you ready? Make sure you got your pencils, get your keyboard, make sure you're ready to take notes on this. Ready? So wealth of the colonies. Let's just say, for instance, you want to live in New England. Bam! You will make some money. good life, Protestant work ethic. It makes you go to church twice on Sunday, at least once on Wednesday. And by the way, do not cross the hierarchy. And if you do, you might be called a witch. If you live in the middle colonies, life's a little bit better. You make some more money. Because the middle colonies, they are able to ship grains. So, New England was doing the fishing, they're doing the lumber, and they're doing the shipbuilding. But the climate's not that great. You can't grow a lot of crops. The beneficiaries here are the middle colonies. Because the middle colonies, while they can't grow cash crops, they grow grain extremely well. And they're able to not export it for cash crop value, but they are able to export their grains into New England and south to feed the enslaved individuals in the Chesapeake and lower colonies. And therefore, the middle colonies are making good money. They participate in the fur trade, and they do have some, obviously, shipping as well through New York Harbor. Philadelphia is a port city. But then we get to that crappy place to live, the Chesapeake, right? Well, if you want to make some money, you're probably going to live by the late 18th century, so you're going to make some money. The problem, of course, is what are you doing there? You're going to grow tobacco. And the tobacco market is pretty well glutted. But then we have those lower colonies. What do we make of there? Well, whoa! That's the place if you want to make money. But don't forget, if you're white, you represent only 1/3 of the population. And the reality is you're much closer because 2/3 of the population will be enslaved Africans. And the cool part here for them, they are newer, so they don't have the issue that the Chesapeake has where they've flooded the market and drastically dropped the price. They also have the ability to have 2 cash crops. You should always build your economy on more than one industry. For instance, city of Houston. For years and years and years, it was oil, 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 oil. But oil is not even the #1 industry in Houston anymore. Medicine is, medical center, the largest medical center in the world. And therefore, we have these twin economic engines driving the economy in Houston. Compared to my old home state of Michigan, Detroit, Flint, they were built on auto industry, auto industry, auto industry. But what happens when the auto industry outsources or moves? Those cities collapse. So you want to build your economy on multiple industries. And the Chesapeake had tobacco. And as tobacco rose and fell, so did their economy. But the lower colonies, the southern colonies, they had both indigo and rice and tremendous amounts of enslaved labor. And what they will do, though, is they will import food from the middle colonies, again, helping drive their economic system. And so you also can see the other correlation here. The amount of money a colony makes is based upon their percentage of enslaved labor. The more money they make, it means the more enslaved labor they use and employ. And like I said, as we said last time, enslaved labor in the lower colonies, nearly 2/3 of the population is enslaved. So that's the economic side of things. But what about this diversity of, again, how many people are we talking here? I say 2/3, I give you percentages, but what does this mean in real numbers? Well, as you can see, during the 17th century, so from 1607 to 1700, there are only a total of 10,000 slaves actually come into what is now the United States. And you can see by the map below, the vast majority are heading to the Caribbean and even more heading down to Brazil, which is one of the worst places in the world to be if you're an enslaved individual. Look at that second line there, though. During the 18th century, from 1700 to 1775, the eve of the Revolution, 80,000 white immigrants came. 50,000 were convicts. So you're talking only 30,000 free white individuals compared to 350,000 enslaved Africans. Think about that for a minute. This is not just a percent here. This is not just, there's a few black people here and there that's creating diversity. No. 30,000 free whites, or 80,000 total, if you want to look at it that way. 350,000 enslaved Africans. That's more than 4 times the number of total white Europeans. It's more than 4 times it. That is tremendous racial diversity, something that does not exist back in England. Again, this is that diversity. Now, again, I would be remiss not to discuss the institution of slavery right here and now. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about slavery, about the horrific atrocity of what this country and much of the world did to enslaved Africans. You got to realize, I want to bring up some myths while I'm at it. Most people think that, oh, Europeans, they went and got Africans, stole them, and took them across the Atlantic Ocean, dumped them off, and sold them. Well, that's mostly correct. But the reality is, prior to slavery existing in the colonies, there was already slavery in Africa. However, what does change, though, is slavery becomes more violent once Europeans get involved. This is a couple of the big key things here. Slavery already existed for thousands of years. It existed all over the world since the beginning of time. However, once Europeans get involved with Africans in the slave trade, it becomes more intense, it becomes more violent, and it changes drastically. You see, we talked about the Native Americans, right? We talked about how they conducted warfare. Remember that a couple lectures ago? How they would go and they wanted to humiliate the other tribe, not exterminate, humiliate, by beating the tribe in warfare and taking captives. Well, these are slaves. These are enslaved individuals. And often, though, remember, this is not perpetual slavery. The goal of this was to increase the size of your tribe. Notice that. This is to increase the size of your tribe. So, yes, there was slavery in Africa. Other tribes would go to war. They would beat another tribe. They would take captives. And theoretically, by definition, they are enslaved individuals. But this was not perpetual slavery. This was not, oh, because we caught you in war now, you are going to be our slave till you die. Your children will be slaves until they die. Their children will be slaves, and so forth and so on. No, it was, hey, you're captured in slavery. Give us a few years, adopt our culture, and you will become one of us. Now, you can make some arguments about assimilation issues, and there are other arguments and problems with that. But that was the way slavery was done in Africa, much like it was in the North and South America prior to European contact with Native Americans. And again, if you go back to my very first lecture we do, my very first statement was, in 1492, there was no such thing as an Indian. Well, I'm going to repeat this with a small change here. In 1492, there was no such thing as an African. And African did not exist, much like an Indian did not exist prior to 1492. Truthfully, black people did not exist as a racial category in 1492. And again, I want you to keep this in mind. There's a very similar overlap here between Native American culture and African culture, because African culture, much like Native American culture, was very tribal. Yeah, neighboring tribes would sometimes go to war, they would sometimes be friends, they would sometimes be allies, they would sometimes raid each other. Sometimes they would, peacefully coexist. Some would grow larger, some would form kingdoms, and there were a number of large kingdoms on the western coast of Africa. Look at the map there, you see where it says Gold Coast. Let me draw a little right there for you, right there. And there were a number of large kingdoms that were run by African kings on the coast. And so ultimately, what we term the slave trade is a very complex web of exchange, much like the Atlantic Ocean trade was. And the actual trade of enslaved individuals was a part, and it became a large part, but initially a very small part, of a much more diverse trade that included goods like gold, salt, cotton, pottery, weaving, metalworking. But as time marched on, more and more of the trade became about humans and chattel slavery. So here's what's different about this now, right? So the similarities are there. There are already slavery that existed, just like it kind of existed in North and South America. Indians compare favorably in this regard to Africans. Both are very tribal. But here's the thing. What makes the Atlantic slave trade, what makes this period of history so unique? Remember, slavery has already always existed. The two big changes is, number one, it's now race-based. You don't get your freedom when you for so many years you assimilate. You are a slave for life, and because of the color of your skin, perpetually everyone who's related to you, your lineage, will also be slaves. It's hereditary, it's race-based. Just because the color of your skin is black, that makes you an enslaved individual, according to the Atlantic slave trade. And second, it's massive scale. It is the largest forced migration in human history. Millions of Africans will be shipped across the Atlantic in servitude. Now, there are kind of three legs to the slave trade. And then we're going to break these down in three separate legs. I think it's important to understand because this does break some misconceptions. You see those bright green spots on the right map over there? Those represent large kingdoms. And these are also port cities that are run by African kings. It's important to note, Europeans, for the entirety basically of the 18th century, never set foot in Africa past the coast. Their ships are not able to sail up the African rivers. They're not able to go into mainland Africa. They sail their ships to the coast, they dock, they make their trade for gold, manufactured goods in exchange for human capital, and they leave. Thus, the initial part of the slave trade is not controlled by Europeans. It is controlled by African kings on the coast. And this brings me to the point of there was no such thing as an African prior to 1500. Because a lot of students always ask me, like, well, hey, Dr. Olmsted, why would an African sell another African? Well, it's because they don't identify as African. They have no commonality, much like Indians not identify as Indians. They identified as Seneca, Chippewa, etc. The African tribes also identified as individual tribes. They are separate cultures, they are separate entities. The same way the French separate themselves from the British, who separate themselves from the Spanish, who separate themselves from the Germans, who separate from the Italians. They're all separate. They don't see themselves as, common. And therefore, these African kings, through warfare or just plain kidnapping, would send men into the interior of Africa, and they would round up slaves. They would capture men, women, and children, people who felt they could sell and make money on and make themselves richer. Now, this first leg of the slave trade, this is leg number one, this first phase. This is where you march across the continent of Africa. Now, in the early days, it was pretty easy. Go back to my other map real quick. You could probably find, maybe my cursor here, you could find people here, you could raid their tribes, and you could march them for a couple days back to the coast. But by the time the slave trade is entering into 50 years, or the late 1700s, they're having to go further and further into Africa to raid other tribes, to capture captives, and then march them back across the continent. And so this is what it looks like. They chain them together. They forcibly march them. You see the one man has a gun. The rest of them are all hooked together, therefore they cannot revolt. And during this march, that could take up to 6 months, up to 25% of the captives would die. Now, once they arrive on the western coast, back to my map real quick for you. Once they arrive back on the western coast, they'll be held there for an indeterminate number of days or months. They'll be put near the ocean in an open cell, in a pen, stuffed together, far more than is humane. And they'll be held there waiting to purchase from European slave traders. Now, of course, the Europeans arrive, they begin to inspect the goods, these humans, and this was a very dehumanizing process. Because what they're looking for is some specific characteristics. They want someone young, ideally in their 20s, who will, or maybe late teens, who's going to be strong enough and youthful enough to survive and work for a long time. They're looking for healthy individuals. They also want a mix of Africans from different tribes. Why? They don't want Africans who speak the same language. Because remember, much like Native Americans, there's great diversity of language in Africa among different tribes. Why? Because that would make communication between the Africans very difficult, which means it'd be very hard to plan an uprising or revolt. Now you got to picture this though. This is a very dehumanizing thing. Because they're marched across the sea, they're held in these pens, then the Europeans come to begin to inspect them. And when they inspect them, I mean they inspect them in a very inhumane process. They open up their mouths and check their teeth for disease. They look all over their bodies. They will look at the person's genitals. They will look at the person's anus. They're looking for disease. They're looking for anything that might be communicable. Because once they get on that ship for the next month or two, disease is going to spread rampant. They don't want sickly individuals. If you want a visualization, if anyone's ever done Future Farmers of America or 4-H, or anyone especially who's tried to sell, say, a cow at the rodeo, when they're inspecting cattle, they check over every orifice. They prod, they pick, they look at things that most people would not even want to think about. But they do that because they're looking for a healthy individual. And Europeans treated Africans as, well, cattle, a piece of meat. Now, once they decide their purchase, they make the exchange with the African kings. The kings say, thank you very much, come back next time. And the Europeans load these enslaved individuals on their ships. And yes, I know, I don't like the word triangular trade, but this is where we get that idea from, because they're trading gold for enslaved Africans and then taking them back across the Atlantic, dumping them off for cash. But it's this middle leg here, and you see here, I have it marked here. That's why I use the triangle in this time. Let me go back here for you. You see this long right here. This trip right here is known as the Middle Passage, because it's the middle leg of the trip. And the Middle Passage is the one you hear most often in history classes. It's called this, of course, it's the middle leg of the trip. It's the route between Africa and the New World. And this is the middle part of the enslavement of Africans. Africans will be packed very tightly in the ships, as tightly as possible, because remember, space is money. Enslavers want to get as many people on that ship as possible. The space allotted for a human was 6 feet tall by 30 inches deep. Now, I don't know about you, but that's less space than most caskets are. Think about that. We afford more room to a deceased person than these slave captains did to enslaved individuals. Now, most often, you don't see in this picture, but most often, they'll be chained below deck. You see it on the far left over there, in tightly packed areas, usually naked, or darn close to it. They'll be chained together so they can't get up and walk around or plan a revolt. They'll be under deck, because if they're above deck, they tend to jump off and commit suicide, try to get away, because they know what's going to happen to them. There's no indoor plumbing, There's no place to go to the bathroom so often that you just went where you lied, which means, yes, you were defecating on the person next to you. I guess glass half full, looking at things, you're probably not going to go a lot of either number one or number two because they're not going to feed you much. Just barely enough to keep you alive, which means you're not going to produce any excrement, which also makes disease run rampant, though. This leg of the middle passage was anywhere from 3 weeks to several months, and the mortality rate was once again another 25%. Now, please note, the 25% of the first leg and 25% of the middle passage is not 50%. This is 25% of the 75% remaining. But the mortality rate is 25%. You're talking in a space of less than about 2 feet by 6 feet is all the space you're given. And this is if you're a male. Now picture if you're a female. You're sitting there chained up, mostly naked, with a bunch of men who have not seen a woman in months at a time. You're in a very precarious situation if you're an enslaved African woman. Rape was common, and it was brutal. And the thing is, some ask, why do they do this? Well, yeah, there's the economic reasons. It's money. But this entire process, the space given, the chain treatment, the food given, lack of food given, the rape, all of this was part of a process of dehumanization. This was intended to dehumanize Africans so they would internalize that they were indeed weaker and lower and subhuman, with the express purpose of creating pliant and obedient enslaved individuals. This was the point. Here's a little visual for you.
The thing that distinguishes slavery in Africa from Atlantic slavery is race. Europeans set in motion a system of slavery that was predicated on the idea that certain people were marked as enslavable. We've learned a great deal about the Middle Passage in the last 40 years or so. The volume of the trade involved the removal of about 12.5 million people from the African continent. The Middle Passage was the middle leg of a voyage that starts in Europe. The first passage is from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America. And then the third passage is the journey back from America to Europe.
The Middle Passage could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
You're talking about hundreds of people. You're at 120 degrees. It smells terrible. There are actually people dying around you, which has to be a traumatic experience for everybody on board.
Maybe 10% of voyages, we know there was some attempt to rise up, to kill the crew, to try to turn the boat around, to change their destinies. Historians have a hard time capturing what the Middle Passage must have felt like for enslaved men and women. It's a voyage that is deeply disorienting. It's a voyage to a place that you can't anticipate. You don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't think we have adequate words to capture that experience.
I know this ain't home, but it's where you gotta be. It's time your family pay conta.
Now, the reality is once you get to that destination in the colonies, you're dropped off at the port city. Now, I want to make one small little disclaimer about that. You heard him say that the first leg was a trip from Europe to Africa, then from Africa to the colonies, then back to Africa. That's the point of the triangle trade, that kind of marking that idea. But the legs that we're talking about here is just the trip of the enslaved Africans. So the first leg was the part in Africa. The second leg is the Middle Passage. This is a separate, not a triangle. The third leg begins when they get to their destination in the colonies, whether it is Charleston, whether it's Boston, whether it's New York. And the ship captains will drop off the enslaved Africans. They will put them in pens once again. They will hose them down a bit to make them smell a little bit better. They will usually put on some kind of new clothes. I don't mean nice clothes at all, but just something presentable. And then they'll be brought out to a slave auction, and where they will be once again inspected in very crude manners. Again, checking their genitals, having them bend over, having them look up their anus, have them open their mouths up and check their teeth and their tongues for any disease, etc. Because they want to make a good investment if you're a plantation owner who wants to buy human capital. And so, again, they want healthy, young-looking Africans. Older people, children, women will take longer to sell because these enslavers, these plantation owners, are looking, again, for these different diverse backgrounds and languages, again, to prevent any future revolts. Now, the worst place to go was Brazil. Second worst was the Caribbean. On the scale of things, the best place, I guess, was what is now the United States as far as climate and conditions. And again, I'm not trying to say that it was good here, because it was not. It was horrific and terrible, something we'll discuss a little bit in the second half of this lecture. But by far the worst place to go, if you were in the colonies, the American colonies, was the Carolinas. It was the hottest, it was the harshest, it was the hardest. And you better believe, as you saw in the little video there was constant pressure, constant pushes to revolt and try to obtain freedom. And that is something that enslaved Africans in the American colonies will attempt to do. But we'll discuss that in the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.